My name is Margaret Ellis. I was 27 when I began the diary, though most days I felt much older. It was 1871, and I worked in the south wing of St. Augustine's Hospital in Birmingham, where the ceilings leaked and the smell of carbolic soap never quite covered the stench beneath. They told us not to keep records, not personal ones anyway. The matron said feelings had no place in the wards, and that no one cared for a nurse's opinion so long as her apron stayed white and her hands stayed moving. But I wrote anyway, at night, by candlelight, in the corner of the laundry room where the floor was still warm from the boiler. I wrote what I saw, what I felt, what I was told to forget, because I knew that one day someone might need to remember. We worked in shifts that never truly ended. I woke before sunrise, dressed in the dark, and tied my hair so tightly that my scalp ached by noon. There was no softness in our work, just bedpans and broken skin, children with rashes we didn't yet have names for, and men who shouted when the laudanum wore off. I was trained not to flinch, not when the coughing turned wet, not when a boy's fever boiled his mind into confusion, not even when the doctor pressed too close behind me and said my name like it didn't belong to me anymore. There was one patient I never forgot. His name was Edward Lane. He had a gash on his leg that wouldn't close, and eyes that looked far older than his face. He didn't speak often, but when he did, he said things I didn't expect, things about the dark corners of the hospital and the things he'd heard in the night. At first I thought it was the fever, but then I heard it too. Once, while fetching water after hours, I passed the surgical wing. The lamps were dimmed, but there were voices inside, low, urgent, not like any nurse or doctor I knew. I stood there, listening, breath held, and then I saw something I still can't explain. A figure moving past the glass, white coat stained at the sleeves, though no operations were scheduled that night. I told no one, but I wrote it down. I kept the diary hidden beneath the floorboards of the supply closet. 3 nurses shared that space, but only I knew which plank creaked just enough to lift. I didn't write for fame or remembrance. I wrote because some things were too heavy to carry alone. And even now, if you're reading this, you should know the worst parts of this story were never meant to be told at all. I thought at first that I had imagined it, that maybe the long hours, the fumes from the tinctures, or the weight of everything we weren't allowed to say had started to distort the edges of reality. But once you see something that doesn't make sense, truly doesn't belong, you start to notice other things too. The corridor outside the surgical wing had a door at the end that no one used, not patients, not nurses. It had been nailed shut years before, or so I was told. Some of the older women said it led to the old infectious ward that burned in the cholera outbreak of '62. Matron said it was nothing. Storage, she muttered once, as if even the word offended her. But I'd seen someone walk through it. I didn't speak of it again for several days. Not until Edward Lane asked me, very quietly, whether I ever heard the footsteps that didn't echo. I froze. He watched me carefully as if he already knew my answer. "Don't follow them," he whispered. "They don't lead where you think." He died the next morning. He wasn't even scheduled for surgery. The night nurse found him pale, eyes wide open, with no wound bleeding and no known infection. They marked it as sudden cardiac failure, but when I helped prepare his body, I noticed something beneath the sheet. His left hand was clenched so tightly the fingernails had broken the skin. I asked if anyone had seen him during the night. No one had. But later in the laundry, one of the girls, Alice, confessed that she had heard something, a dragging sound, like boots on wet stone. She hadn't looked. None of us looked any more, not directly. Still, I couldn't leave it alone. That evening, I returned to the corridor. I told myself I'd just check the door, see that it was still sealed, perhaps find an answer that made sense. The hallway was quiet, colder than it should have been, and my shoes felt louder than I'd ever noticed before. The last lamp flickered once and then went out. The door was open. Just a crack, but open. I stood there, heartbeat in my throat, the air in front of me still as death. I didn't step through, not then. I turned and walked quickly back to the ward, hands shaking, vision swimming. That night I wrote 7 pages in the diary. I couldn't sleep. Not because of what I'd seen, but because of what I might see next. And deep down I knew I was going to open that door, even if I never came back. I waited 3 nights, not because I changed my mind, but because something in me needed to feel sure. I worked my shifts as I always did, wrapping wounds, measuring pulses, clearing basins full of things no one wanted to name, but all the while I felt it, that open door like a breath waiting to be exhaled. I checked it in secret, once in the morning, once at dusk. Each time it was closed again as if it had never been disturbed. No scratches, no footprints, only the thick stillness of stone and shadow. On the 4th night, I took a lantern. I told Alice I needed to check the supply cellar for fresh gauze. I lied. She nodded and went back to counting linens. I waited until the ward was quiet, until even the coffers had settled into shallow sleep, then slipped down the south corridor with the lantern tucked beneath my shawl. The door creaked when I touched it, not loudly, but enough to make the hairs on my neck rise. The air that leaked through was cold, stale, like the inside of a crypt. I pushed it open. The passage was narrower than I remembered. The walls closed in around me, damp with condensation. My skirts brushed against the brick, leaving dark streaks on the hem. I held the lantern up high. The flame wavered, casting long shadows that moved like they didn't belong to me. The floor sloped downward. After maybe 20 paces I reached another room, small, stone-lined, empty except for one thing, a rusted bed frame, bolted to the floor, and a leather strap still hanging loose from the side, the kind they use when patients won't stop screaming. I stepped closer and saw something beneath the bed, something pale, a scrap of fabric. I reached for it and felt my fingers brush a name, barely visible under the dust. C. Harrow. A patient's tag. But Harrow was listed as discharged. I remembered. I'd helped dress his leg after he fell from a service cart. He walked out weeks ago, waved to the ward. That's what we were told. Behind me, the door creaked shut. I turned. Fast. But no one was there. The corridor was empty. I walked back the way I came, this time faster, the flame dancing in my hand. And as I neared the end of the passage, I heard it. Footsteps behind me. Measured. Wet. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I had, I don't think I'd be here to write this. but I made it to the stairwell, and when I looked at my hands, the tag was gone. Only the dust remained. After that night, I was not the same. I did not speak of the corridor again. I returned to my duties, nodded when spoken to, smiled when expected, but I moved through the hospital like a ghost, present in body, but never fully there. I still made my rounds, still answered the bell. But my mind lingered behind the walls, where names disappeared and no one asked why. 2 days later, I checked the registry. There was no record of C. Harrow ever being admitted. Not in the ledger, not in the discharge files. His name had been erased, not crossed out, not archived, but removed, as though he'd never existed. I mentioned it to Alice in passing. She said I must be mistaken, that I'd been working too many hours, that perhaps I had confused him with someone else, but I knew better. I began to notice other things, beds that were stripped but never remade, supplies that vanished without explanation, a tray left beside an empty cot with no name on the tag. And late one night, the faint sound of weeping from behind the chapel wall, where the staircase to the old basement had been sealed for years. I continued writing. Every night, sometimes only a few lines, sometimes a dozen pages. It became the only place I allowed myself to be honest. I wrote about what I saw, what I feared, and what the hospital tried to hide. Then, one morning, I found a note, slipped beneath my pillow. It read only 4 words. Stop writing. Stop remembering. No signature, no explanation, just that. I burned the note in the fireplace. But I did not stop, because by then the diary was not just for me. It was a record, a witness, a warning. And now, if you are holding these pages, it means you found what I buried, perhaps behind the supply closet wall, perhaps beneath the broken tile in the laundry, perhaps somewhere else entirely. I left no instructions for where to look, only the hope that someone, someday, would. Please understand, this is not a story meant for comfort. I was a nurse. I helped people live, and I held their hands when they could not, but I also watched them disappear, not to death, but to silence. And that silence was always the most frightening thing of all. So if you're reading this, know that the hospital is gone now, the corridors have crumbled, the doors have rotted shut, but the truth I wrote remains, and that truth may still be listening.